and Spencer Millian, representing work that happened in Jordan and Guatemala, respectfully. So with that, I will hand things over to Kate, who will lead us off in, like I said, the initial part of the literature and program review of the Making Cities Work IDIQ. And just as a bit of broader context, this review both gives us insight into the 18 task orders that were part of Making Cities Work, but this establishes a foundation and a cornerstone for how we are going to be thinking about urban and local governance work moving forward in the governance office and DRG as well. So with that, I'll pass things off to Kate, and she can get us moving in that direction. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
And if you have any questions, put them in. You can just put them in the chat, and I'll monitor that, and then we'll take those after the speakers. Thanks.
Yes, that sounds great. Thank you, Kevin. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Kate Merple-Cantrell. I am a senior researcher at the Cloudburst Group and a co-author on this study, and I will let my co-author Moira introduce herself when we get to the literature review portion. But like Kevin said, today we're going to walk through some background on the methods and the purpose of the literature and program review. Then Moira will present the literature review findings. I'll present the program review findings, and then I'll turn it back over to Kevin and Brendan and Spencer for the mission reflections, and we'll open it up for discussion and Q&A. So some background on our study. Like Kevin mentioned, Making Cities Work IDIQ lasted for 10 years and dispersed over $500 million, issuing 18 task orders for urban governance work with the aim to enable USAID to address challenges and opportunities of global urbanization, provide access to short and long-term technical services, training, capacity building in areas related to improving urban and local governance, and support the implementation of USAID's sustainable service delivery in an increasingly urbanized world policy. It was pretty cross-cutting in nature. The IDIQ had 5 outcomes that we explored, and then that mapped onto their 5 functional areas, the way that it was designed. So the first one really has to do with public service delivery, with an emphasis on transportation, water and sanitation, and solid waste management. The second one is kind of like, I would say, the traditional decentralization package programming. So that has to do with increasing the autonomy, transparency, responsiveness, and accountability of urban and local governments. The third has to do with climate change adaptation and pollution control. The fourth deals with disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. And the fifth deals with local government finance, creditworthiness, and borrowing. So the purpose of our study, this literature and program review, was to, on the program review side, aggregate what USAID has learned across its 18 task orders under Making Cities Work, and complement this on the literature review side with USAID specific learning, complement this USAID specific learning with broader learning from academic research about urban governance and what can we learn there. Our methods were this literature review, and Moira will explain those methods a little bit more in the introduction to literature review. We then reviewed publicly available documentation of each of the Making Cities Work task orders that we felt were relevant towards its stated outcomes in the 5 thematic areas. So we did exclude a couple that were not as directly relevant. And then we supplemented this desk review with key informant interviews with mission contacts who had task orders under Making Cities Work, implementing partners, and key USAID DC contacts who were involved in the IDIQ as well. And I will pass it over to Moira to summarize the literature review.
Thank you, Kate. Hello, I'm Moira O'Neill. I am a professor of law specializing in local government law, state government law at the University of Virginia's Law School, and also a research scientist in the Institute of Urban and Regional Development at UC Berkeley. So the way we approached this literature review is we documented our search terms. Our focus, of course, was to try to track down any prior research or analysis, theorists, discussing whether urban investments could impact democratic outcomes. We were defining our terms in terms of democratic outcomes to focus on participation in elections, local government participation, or increased community capacity. We were thinking broadly about urban investment to mirror some of the strategies and investment that were going to be the focus of the desk review work that Kate led. In our work, we basically documented the terms so that we could replicate this search if we needed to, and focused on 8 search engines, 2 of which were publicly accessible, Google Scholar, and the other 6 were university focused. In that work, we did find some literature that provided support for the theoretical notion that an investment into local public infrastructure would improve democratic outcomes, but we will talk about the limitations of what it is that we were able to find through the course of this literature. So primary findings really focused on the opportunity that urbanization and cities and decentralization can offer for improving democracy and democratic outcomes. In particular, scholarship that documents how increased urbanization creates a condition or a context in which there might be a fostering of more civic capital, more capacity for coordinated public action, all of which can be conditions that are supportive of democracy. There was also, of course, in the literature, substantial discussion about the theory and the purpose of decentralization in terms of allowing people to be more active participants within democracy, to potentially, for example, be involved in more direct democracy as opposed to representative democracy at the local level. There was, of course, also discussion about the limitations of the conditions of urbanization and the circumstances and contexts in which there could be the experience of regime change. And this was in large relationship to the reality that increased urbanization creates a situation of increased need. And so that is where the investment in public delivery of services and demand for infrastructure grows, and why it's so important that the people living within those urban contexts both can access basic services, but also have transparency around delivery of those services and accountability. The literature was pretty clear that where services falter, people's perception of government sours, and that can be conducive or that can be harmful for emerging democracies. So one of the things we also looked at were the conditions that helped foster success in terms of service delivery. So one of the things we discovered is that it was much bigger than just investing in discrete services such as waste, water management, and so on. There was also a critical need to invest in the administration of those services. In other words, ensuring that local government institutions have the administrative capacity to deliver on each of the services that they are responsible for. Because if they're not able to demonstrate that those services are being delivered in a fair way, that has a huge impact on people's perception of their government's ability to meet their needs. So what we saw were mixed outcomes with respect to investment in local government, delivery of services, and positive outcomes were often associated more with the capacity, not only investment in the actual service, but capacity to be accountable for delivery and to demonstrate that all members of the community had access to essential services. So I'm going to now pass it back over to Kate.
Thanks, Moira. I'm going to talk us through our program review findings. And like I mentioned, these findings will follow the 5 thematic areas in Making Cities Work. But because of the kind of uneven volume of task orders by thematic area, we actually combined thematic areas 3 and 4, which are climate change adaptation and resilience. And we are going to add a 5th area of findings, which is cross-sectoral integration, which was not a stated kind of like goal of the IDIQ, but in our discussions with USAID found that it would be really interesting to explore how these task orders may have pursued or achieved cross-sectoral integration in their programming. So we'll start with task order 1, public service, or thematic area 1, public service delivery. There were 14 task orders under this thematic area, including 11 that prioritized support for transportation, water, or solid waste management, which were the priority focus areas, given their links to desired health and economic development outcomes. I would say all of those task orders in those priority areas were in water and solid waste management. We did not see transportation-focused service delivery task orders. An additional 6 task orders focused on decentralization and improved service delivery. This was because they posited that investments in local government capacity and accountability would lead to improved service delivery. So in each thematic area, I'm going to walk you through a slide like this. So you'll see kind of like what we saw as key successes in this area, what we found were key contributors to this success, and some lessons learned for the future. So here in public service delivery, we did see that the theories of change that we were looking at, this kind of like focus on building local government capacity for service delivery, was consistent with the literature that Moira just summarized. And the task orders made significant inroads in building local government capacity to provide quality services. Some of the key contributors to this success were grants under contract, in-kind grants or buy-ins, which was employed by several task orders and allowed USAID to simultaneously invest in service delivery improvements across several localities, amplifying its reach. This integrated approach to service strengthening was also aligned with the scholarly research we just heard about that suggests that governance interventions are more successful when supported by complementary interventions. And engaging the private sector and municipalities in job creation and service delivery also increased impact and leveraged additional resources towards realizing outcomes. In terms of lessons learned, I think the key ones for us are there's still a lot of data gaps in this space, and local governments still require timely access to quality metrics about service delivery. This helps them capture revenue, it helps them provide better services, and it helps us and them track service delivery outcomes so we can really see whether we're realizing improvements in services. Governments also, I don't think this is news to anyone, but continually struggle with resource deficiencies. So investing in capacity when there are kind of like long-term resource deficiencies might not be transformative. This could limit the sustainability of investments and service delivery capacity if we don't kind of like think about how to act on those two fronts at the same time. And the last thing was that we saw a lot of indication of increases in service delivery capacity across the task orders. When we looked towards whether increases in service delivery capacity led to better service delivery outcomes, we really were confronted by a lack of data. And so there's a couple different issues there. When this was studied, for example, some task orders had evaluations, some had final outcome harvesting. The results were somewhat mixed in the sense that it seemed like there might be a lag between investments in capacity and realizing those outcomes. The other challenge is that this data is not consistently collected at the activity level. And so there's more about metrics of implementation, outputs, things like that, than like looking at long-term indicators of service delivery quality. So that's a potential consideration to keep in mind during theory of change development and also activity and indicator design. Moving on to thematic area 2, 10 out of the 18 McKinsey's work task orders included programming in this area. And work under this area sought to increase local government autonomy by supporting the decentralization of responsibilities and through strengthening local institutional capacity to perform government services. This work also sought to nurture a citizen's ability to demand government accountability through improving the quality of information about government performance available to citizens and enhancing citizen capacity to use that information to demand improvements. We found that the Making Cities Work task orders took steps to ensure that local governments responded to citizen inputs and demands. They also promoted internal and external local government accountability by tightening internal systems and empowering local citizens as intended to hold elected officials and staff accountable. Some contributors to success here were, when it's possible, this building government partner ownership. I think, recognize that it's difficult to build that buy-in, that ownership, but co-designing with stakeholders from project inception to match activities to clearly codify municipal needs really does pay dividends in terms of creating a culture of ownership and adaptation with government partners and fostering sustainability. Building buy-in among communities is also important. And so kind of like designing task orders intentionally to show citizens the results of their engagement and kind of providing accountability wins can encourage political will. That can be very useful. And finally, addressing the resource constraints that we discussed earlier, thinking about strategically identifying and providing material support, both to foster sustainability as appropriate, but also it can help establish the project as a trusted source of assistance. In terms of lessons learned, some of this programming pursued a phased approach where there were phase 1 communities. It could be a smaller subset. Well, the program was kind of working out the intervention and then maybe scaled up or moved on to like a second cohort. And there's obvious capacity reasons why this might be an attractive option. There's also some things to consider with this approach, mainly that sometimes because of time or resource constraints nearing the end of a project, or simply because of dissolution of resources among many communities, the second cohort sometimes received less assistance than the first, kind of like diluting the impact of the project. It's also important to manage complexity and be mindful of initial assessment periods. Moving to thematic areas 3 and 4. 4 task orders included work under thematic areas 3 and 4. And these task orders recognizes that cities' density and concentration of critical infrastructure amplifies the humanitarian and environmental challenges that they face due to climate change. So this programming sought to equip cities with resources and strategies necessary to prepare for and respond to emerging threats. And a core goal of this work was to reduce urban pollution. Much of the climate change adaptation work under Making Cities Work focused on risk assessment and mitigation capacities. Comparatively little of the work focused on environmental management. And 2 task orders focused on ocean pollution control, and both made substantial contributions to preventing plastic pollution. Some contributors to success in this area were social and behavior change approaches through both education and outreach, as well as monetary and non-monetary incentives at the policy level saw successful mitigation strategies. And forging partnerships with local governments and private sector partners, particularly because local governments are responsible for environmental sustainability without having the appropriate capacity and budget in many cases. So addressing this reality is a really important objective, I think, across USAID and also government and the private sector to see changes in climate change adaptation mitigation. That kind of also flips onto our lessons learned, which is that this is local and that there are really real challenges, and there's the context is very varied and diverse, and so thinking through the challenges there. Under thematic area 5, local government finance, creditworthiness, and borrowing, there were 8 task orders that included work here. The objective of the work here was to make more resources available to local governments in order to improve service delivery, either through increasing own source revenue or through borrowing. A key intervention involved in assisting municipalities in amplifying their own source revenue to foster local government autonomy, notably through enhanced local tax and service fee recovery mechanisms. And the task order saw key successes in this area, particularly through initiatives such as mobile payment platforms, mapping and other strategies to recover property tax revenue. There was also a significant amount of capacity support to manage revenue and some support for local governments to attract investment. Far fewer task orders focused directly on creditworthiness, although one did. We saw a lot of quick wins here. So that's one of the contributors to success, is that there's really still a lot of opportunity here to make a huge impact, because many localities across the Making Cities Work task orders began from a baseline of very low resource mobilization. So simple tools help them make large gains in revenue. We learned that blended finance mechanisms were perhaps an underutilized tool that could make efficient use of donor support while encouraging sector expansion. And that interventions aimed at resource mobilization need to be aware of the political incentives that may drive local governments away from potential revenue sources. So this was very uneven. It kind of depended on the political context by municipality, but some were interested in, for example, property tax collection, and some really thought that that would hurt them politically. So they might prefer to focus on collecting service fees or collecting commercial income tax. In terms of cross-sectoral integration, this is our last area of inquiry, and this is the one that we added through this program review. We did see that the work of the task orders under Making Cities Work intersected with other key USAID development sectors, namely economic development, health, and education. The integration of work in these sectors rarely involved official collaboration with other mission technical offices in these sectors, especially at the outset. The task orders were able to achieve promising successes nonetheless. I'm going to walk through each of those one at a time. So we'll start with economic development. And so investments in service delivery and revenue generation often have a reinforcing relationship with efforts to attract and develop local economies. So there were a couple things that we saw here. Definitely we saw service delivery investments, especially in local urban infrastructure, street naming, mapping, things like that, transfer really readily to economic development initiatives. We also saw some sorry, just a minute. I'm so sorry for that. Moving on. That was local economic development. We'll move on to health. Most of the investments in Making Cities task orders in health were focused around the COVID-19 pandemic response, which happened during this 10-year period. And some of this work had to do with kind of like the activity was in the right place at the right time and could help get resources where they needed to go. And some of this had to do with kind of like complementary health governance work, tracking resources that activities were able to provide. And then education work under Making Cities task orders focused on work in schools around waste reduction. And it also focused in one case around complementary investments. So there was an explicit strategy, this is perhaps the exception, that sought to pair USAID's local governance interventions within the same strategic areas with USAID's education investments and investments from other donors. And we did see changes in education outcomes in that case. So it does seem to be particularly fruitful. In terms of lessons learned, I just gave the example about the potential power of complementary investments. We did also see some task orders face trade-offs when thinking about how to marry local economic development initiatives with national policy, and the interests of national economic development policies may not be aligned with the interests of localities where local governance interventions are working. We did make several kind of overall strategic recommendations looking forward, following from the findings of our program review. The first is that Making Cities Work IDIQ had a guiding set of objectives on linked issues affecting urban governance and sustainability that seems to have effectively tied WASHing priorities and mission needs. This is evidenced by mission uptake of the IDIQ, especially in the Middle East and North Africa regions. And we also see that there are lessons here to share about IDIQ management, such as this kind of like unique view that the COR has in an IDIQ like this to view the whole portfolio and make sure that learning is being shared across task orders at missions. So we think that the funding mechanisms that have this kind of cross-sectoral global focus on urbanization are important to continue. The second is to think really intentionally about the strategic savvy of investments in local governments. This can be a strategy to realize governance improvement when support from USAID at the national level is not feasible due to political concerns. The third is to kind of think about what our experience, especially under thematic area 2, in the last 10 years means for our decentralization and local governance support going forward. What would a new generation of decentralization programming that builds on these lessons look like? Some learnings that we took out of our review are that it's important to be selective in choosing to engage in decentralization work, making sure that we're really making that investment in the localities where it makes sense, in the context where it makes sense. Using tools like initial assessments to understand the key constraints that local governments face and the most appropriate tools to address them. Co-designing local governance programming to respond to specific municipal priorities and build buy-in and sustainability. And to the extent possible, though this is, I'm sure, very difficult to do, deciding these programs around local timelines and election cycles rather than USAID. We also saw a lot of excitement about digital development. And for us, that really means building a culture that values and uses data. So it continues to support service providers who want to capture data about usage, about service delivery quality, and support them to build that into their operations. And finally, being really intentional about how this work intersects with our priority on anti-corruption work and thinking about where we see corruption at the local government level. Obviously, administrative corruption is often an explicit focus of this work, but there may be other forms of corruption operating at the local level. And awareness of this can ensure that USAID protects resources crucial for development and mitigates programmatic risk. So I will stop here and turn it over to Kevin to introduce our mission speakers.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Kate. Just a couple things that I want to tie from the conversation that Kate and Moira had about the literature and program review. One, just as a note, in terms of some of those recommendations, with the Ending and Making Cities Work, we have a similar IDIQ ACEs that's currently going on. So some of that learning can be transferred over into current task orders now under that mechanism, and then there will be a new governance-focused mechanism coming out next year, and so that can be drawn and learn. The learnings that we have from this effort can inform that process. So I just wanted to emphasize the fact that we're looking back, but that we're also ensuring that this information is being used moving forward as well. And likewise, I want to call everyone's attention. In the chat, there are two infographics. One that is a summary of the findings brief, and then a second about the intersection between urban investments and the DRG policy. So those two really show, graphically sort of the rack up of some of this work. And then also, as I move forward, want to mention it. As we can see, I'll introduce Spencer and Brendan, who both were very critical in advancing the local and urban governance work that they focused on in their respective countries in this partnership working with Washington. And as this activity or this program review demonstrates, there has been a lot of information sharing, both among the missions in Washington, but then also cross missions as a variety of different task orders were coming on. So both Spencer and Brendan were part of this program review, but also over the years have been very effective at providing some of their best practices and lessons learned in terms of how they were managing those. So both Spencer and Brendan will each take 3 minutes, and they each have a few prompts that they've been able to choose from, just to kind of talk a little bit through some of their reactions and some of their perspectives of the Making Cities Work IDIQ. So I'll pass things over to Spencer first, and then after a few minutes, we'll move over to Brendan. And on the screen, we can see in Guatemala, the Urban Municipal Governance Task Order, and then in Jordan, the cities implementing transparent, innovative, and effective solutions. So with that, Spencer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And yeah, I think it's a wonderful reflection, and this is a wonderful session to go through what are all the things that happened through this IDIQ. Well, to explain a little bit about the Urban Municipal Governance Task Order, this was a 7-year project designed specifically to reduce levels of violence in most at risk. Levels of violence in municipality most at risk of violent crime through enhanced municipal governance, increased coverage and quality of municipal services, and greater citizen participation and oversight. As I was reflecting on the 7 years of implementation, one clear lesson stood out, and it's that sustainable urban development and improved governance are inseparable. Because by enhancing municipal capacity and infrastructure, we empower the cities to create safer and more vibrant communities. And one of the most impactful outcomes out of this task order was a significant increase in own-source revenue across all the target municipalities, which an average growth of 18% throughout the 7 years, and some of them even reaching 30% in increase. And with this increased independent revenue, municipalities were better able to provide public services and strengthen local governance autonomy as they minimized their dependency on the national revenue streams. Most importantly for this project specifically, the municipalities, after having those extra funds coming in, they planned and budgeted for over 300 violence prevention and activities, of which now there were institutionalized for long-term implementation without USAID support. And for us, that was a great success. And my initial reflection is that it is crucial when we work in the realm of own source revenue that these increases are tied to strategic investments in public services and development projects that target the most vulnerable citizens in areas where the municipality previously lacked the capacity to respond. So cities most prioritize resources towards underserved communities and critical urban services like infrastructure, safety, and social support. And for us, it was evident that to support violence prevention programs and development of youth and women's and policies, it was specifically aimed to uplift the marginalized groups. So we strategically linked the revenue increases investments in areas that have been historically underserved, because there's always a risk that if a city receives more money, then they're going to invest in other areas that are not necessarily the most present areas, or not necessarily where the project wants, or USAID has also equities that we want them to invest. So we saw Guatemalan cities create a more inclusive environment that address their needs of their most vulnerable citizens. Another reflection and takeaway I want to share is the use of technology. Through this project, we implemented the use of LiDAR and satellite imagery for municipalities to improve their land use planning and property tax collection. In Guatemala City alone, more than 50,000 parcels of land were updated to accurate taxation and help generate much more needed resources. And this technological advancement not only modernized the municipal management, but also strengthened the city's ability to govern effectively by increasing their financial autonomy. And we know that as cities grow, these tools can be crucial in managing urban expansion and ensuring that local governments can meet the needs of their population. Equally important was the role of citizen participation in UMG's efforts to engage communities, especially youth and women. We have shown how inclusive government really creates more resilient cities. In one of our targeted cities, which is a port city in the Atlantic, we work with local authorities to address GBV, gender-based violence. And we introduced gender-based violence services as a municipal service. And after working through the policy establishment and finding the sources of funding, that led for the municipality to establish a women's shelter founded and funded through multiple partnerships. So this initiative not only empowered the community, but also demonstrated how this local government was able to mobilize resources and stakeholders to address their most pressing needs. Another highlight I wanna to talk about during this short intervention is municipal collaboration, intermunicipal collaboration that was fostered to this task order. We brought together municipal staff across the country to share knowledge and best practices on land use planning, finance, and citizen engagement. And we used the knowledge of the biggest and wealthiest city of the country, which is the capital city, Guatemala City, to collaborate between them and smaller cities in spreading innovative solutions, ensuring that these small municipalities can learn and replicate from the success of the capital city, but also to show that urban governments is not about just individual cities improving themselves, but it's about working together to enhance national development. So I think looking ahead, for me, it's clear that strong governance structures rooted in sustainable development are the key to challenges like crime, security, internal migration, and equality. And as we move forward, I do believe that the agency's role in supporting local government with tools, resources, and capacity building will continue to be critical in shaping safer and more prosperous urban spaces for everyone. I'll leave it there because I know they only give me 3 minutes and we have a lot to talk, but those are my initial reflections.
Great, Spencer. Thank you so much. That was a lot of great content packed into 3 minutes. So we thank you for your time and your intervention. Then we'll shift over to Brendan, who will speak on behalf of the city's task order. Brendan?
Yeah, thanks for this. Thanks, colleagues. I don't know if I recognize some names, but not all. So it's great to meet with you. I was COR for the city's activity a couple of hosts ago in Jordan. It was a 5-year, $58 million activity. You know, pretty big. A lot of work we covered. We had several ministry partners. We had 33 primary municipal partners, and we also partnered with on some interventions with all 100 of Jordan's municipalities. So we focused on service delivery improvements, sustainability of municipal operations, community engagement, fostering social cohesion, and promoting local economic development. So just a quick backstory on it. Everything that USAID and everything the USG is doing in Jordan is aimed at Jordan's stability. Jordan was moving forward with some decentralization reform. So from a governance perspective, it really made sense for USAID to assist with that. And then from a democracy perspective, municipalities are really the first place that a citizen goes to in Jordan if they have a problem. And the mayors are actually, interestingly, the only elected leaders that actually have budget authority. So they don't have much budget, but they do actually have budget authority. So it was a really effective, place for us to work, to work with our programming. The project had a rough start. We mentioned the cohort approach. That was the original, and the difference between that and maybe servicing all the municipalities at once. We chose to originally to have a cohort approach, but then, you know, the original COR, you know, chose to go a different direction and just to choose all municipalities at once. This caused a lot of friction, a lot of frustration, and it slowed down implementation. And, you know, it damaged some of the relationships that we had. So we had to quickly, you know, reconfigure, you know, how we were doing business. And we were missing some of the key issues that Jordan really needed with local economic development. And this ended up being one of the major components and areas of success that we were able to deliver on. But just generally, the legacies here, you know, we certainly supported their the thinking behind. We had essentially a think tank behind their decentralization work. That was successful for a while until Jordan kind of pulled back from decentralization, since it really wasn't working administratively on their side, mostly the budget side. You know, sound economic development planning. This is an area that we pivoted to because of some of the frustrations that were communicated to us. And we invested significantly in local economic development planning, master plans, spatial use plans, and an interesting street naming and building numbering activity, which was a discussion on its own. You know, all of that planning, one of the major things we did, we attracted, you know, a significant amount of money, private sector investment to municipalities, and created a lot of jobs. And that's really what Jordan needed. They needed revenue. They needed revenue at the national level, at the municipal level. And most of all, they needed jobs, especially during COVID. And that's really one of the major legacies, is that we brought the municipal sector into the national dialogue. All of a sudden, the government realized that municipalities actually had good ideas and were able to attract investment. And the key thing there was, you know, municipalities didn't have the budget, but they certainly had, you know, the ability to control land and buildings. They had that authority, and with good ideas, we could partner together with private finance. And that really worked well for them. And for the first time, Jordan's municipal level ideas, municipality generated ideas, got put into national level fundraising and investment campaigns, which was amazing. And so it opened up this whole new door, sort of window of opportunity for government, that there is this untapped resource, which is municipalities and citizen-led ideas. And I think that's really the legacy of our activity. I mean, yes, we did a lot internally and on standardization of procedures, position descriptions, understanding of where, you know, how to target revenue generating tax systems. A lot of that citizens don't necessarily see, but we ended up bringing in, you know, real concrete changes to communities and money and jobs into communities. And that really set the stage for the next generation of activity. This was the first real foray that the mission had into the municipal sector. And I think the lesson that came out was really that there's an untapped resource here. It's cross-sectoral, whether it's water, you know, economic growth, DG related work, even health related work. There's real benefit to investing in the municipal sector. Now, the downside was, of course, the capacity was relatively low, and then within some municipalities, extremely low. And so with capacity building, we put a lot of money into capacity building. I'm not really sure, you know, how effective some of it was, since there was some municipalities were starting from such a low level, but other municipalities were starting at a much higher level. I think that really was effective. So I think, you know, one of the lessons learned here is there are sort of centers for growth with the municipal level that maybe that could make perhaps propel other, you know, lesser capacitated municipalities. But I think, you know, when we look at what we were doing in Jordan, we wanted to help stabilize Jordan. To do that, we wanted to help, you know, generate, more revenue for the country, more jobs for Jordanians. And we unlocked a whole new area for the mission to explore. And this certainly set the foundation for the current activity. Just looking at some of the questions here, we certainly, how did we succeed in addressing linked issues? I mean, for sure we did, bringing urban governance into the national perspective, especially on investment promotion. That's a new area that we can claim credit for. what recommendations we have for future, work in cities. I really think that the nexus between local governance and local economic development is something that we need to explore further. And we mentioned earlier in the presentation here, blended finance. One of the things that we started working on was how to set up credit ratings and how bond markets and loan guarantee structures and products for municipalities. This was in its infancy as I was leaving. And should be the a heart and soul of the next activity, but that's something I think not a lot of missions do, and I think it's pretty technical stuff that I think that USAID has good experience in, but perhaps isn't quite isn't really out there for a lot of DG officers. What was most beneficial to achieving the urban governance objectives is attracting local investment. I mean, our street naming and building numbering activities, a lot of people sort of laughed at it, but when you look at it, the economic and governance benefits, we did a sort of a novel economic model to develop the impacts of this, and it was tremendous. And Jordan seized upon it. Other donors seized upon it as places they want to invest their money, and there's lots of value there for our work. What was a relatively small amount of money invested from USAID actually, was translating into a huge benefit for the country. One of the challenges we had with making cities work and our sort of pivot towards local economic development and investment promotion was construction. There was a limited construction ceiling under this, and that was I'd say a constant constraint for us. So as we move forward, I think when you partner local governance with local economic development and investment promotion, having a robust construction at least opportunity. Having that flexibility is really helpful for CORs, and certainly would have been for us. But we found ways around it and partnered with other donors to help with some of the construction work and the private sector. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brendan, and I appreciate your observations, because not everything works exactly the way that it's planned. And over the course of the years that cities, there were some really great benefits out of that. But I appreciate looking at some of the things that could have worked better. But specifically, just kind of looking forward, I wonder, and this isn't necessarily to answer, so to speak, but just kind of putting it out there in terms of if the emphasis on localization, or even now the existence of the local capacity strengthening policy, if that policy had been around when you were designing, this mechanism, cities, I'm guessing there might have been a little bit better continuity between that capacity strengthening that you were looking for and the emphasis, from the agency. So just to say that things evolve and change, and so with future task orders, whether they be in Jordan or elsewhere, that might be a focus. And I'll let you respond in just a second, but just Spencer, I appreciate your overview as well in terms of finance, land use planning, and gender-based violence, and how those things came together as well. So I appreciate your perspective. But we have probably about 8 minutes of Brendan, if you want to react to that. Otherwise, people want to come off mute, ask any question you want, or like I said, throw something in the chat, and hopefully we can address that in the time that we have left. Thank you.
Yeah, no need to respond to it. Thanks.
I'm sorry, what was that?
No, I don't need to respond to that. Thanks.
Okay, no, that's fine. All right, Graham, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. Graham Paul from Pretoria, USAID Southern Africa. We have a new program called Resilient Cities, which is just starting. And this is really, really interesting and super useful. And we've had 1 or 2 DRG colleagues help us through some of the design of it as well. So yeah, lots of interesting lessons and thoughts. I wanted to just come to corruption as one of numerous questions, but I don't want to take up too much time. Corruption is just, it's such a huge issue. You kind of think, well, where on earth do we start, right? The political economy analysis is something that comes up in terms of trying to enhance the understanding of what's happening on the ground in a city, for example. But in terms of implementation and trying to prevent corruption or reduce corruption, are there any kind of thoughts to talk about now or materials that can be shared that are examples of where interventions have taken place that have resulted in kind of, reduced corruption reality, other than the standard, we're all aware of it, but we're not sure what to do with it? Thank you.
Kate, did you want to take that? It looked like you were nodding along.
Yeah, I can do my best. So I can say that it wasn't, in our review, it wasn't a huge focus of a lot of the 18 task orders under Making Cities Work. I'd say when task orders sought to address corruption, it was mostly in kind of like small administrative corruption. So it's like moving towards a payment platform, something like that, to kind of like increase transparency and like where the financial flows are and where that revenue is going. And then moving up from there, there was some work in some task orders on procurement transparency, but the task order, I think, that pursued that found it difficult to enforce when discrepancies were found. So they kind of like put into place a more transparent procurement system, but then they realized that they kind of had a legal issue about how enforcement would take place after that. And another task order did vet public officials that they were working with because they were concerned about different like allegiances to organized crime. Obviously, that's a huge space, and it's a huge issue. It's really difficult to study because people rarely tell you openly when and why they're engaging in corrupt behavior. So I think there's a huge opportunity there as well to continue kind of studying this and iterating on different interventions that can be built into local governance activities.
Yeah, and Graham, just as I can follow up with you offline. The upcoming mechanism that I spoke about, for the governance office is working on, that we have a very strong corruption or anti-corruption component to that mechanism. And I don't bring that up just to say wait for that mechanism, but there's been a lot of consultation with the Anti-Corruption Center here in Washington. So I can kind of pull out some of the threads of those discussions for you in terms of the nexus between what I think you're looking for and sort of kind of how we're thinking about things in terms of that integration. So I'll follow with you offline. Any other questions, comments, reactions in the last few minutes we have left? Graham, the floor is yours again.
If there isn't another hand, maybe.
Not that I see.
think the word integrated has come up quite a lot, and it means so many different things to different people. And at USAID, I think it means so many different things, right? Whether it's earmarks, sectors, services, and in the discussion, it came under kind of public service delivery, and then you've also got this kind of cross-sectoral integration aspect. And I guess you could probably talk about this for an hour at least, but what are the, to expand maybe, what if you had to expand, what are the key aspects to integration? What do we mean by integration actually when we're trying to kind of learn these lessons and do better? Again, you could talk for an hour on that, so I don't expect that obviously, but it's such a key issue that we love to throw around the term, so I'd love to hear some thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, thanks for that, and that might be a good segue to sort of wrap up. So one of the things this dissemination work, actually, Spencer, do you want to raise a point and then before I summarize?
Yeah. I can raise a point for my experience, what integration means. Like for us specifically in Guatemala, we understand that to support self-reliance, our programs must endanger sustainable and long-lasting change. So, however, many of the focus are solely on sector-specific results. For instance, health, education, agriculture, in my case, violence prevention, and they often fall short of reaching our sustainable goals because they overlook governance systems, citizen engagement, and accountability. So they also focus on technical solutions to issues that may, in fact, be due to contextual or political economic constraints. So for us, integrations in all sectors means integrated governance, urban development, lens into our program's approach to become, and this I know has been shown to be sustainable to improve the sector-specific outcomes and sustainability, and to support local ownership and sustainability regardless of sector. This approach in Guatemala has brought together local governments and the community to define problems and needs. So we have provided local governments the tools to plan, finance, and improve services, and help civil society and community constructively engage with the government and hold officials and service providers accountable at the same time. So yeah, I wanted to share that.
That was awesome, and that actually does relate directly to some of the next steps for for this work. So I appreciate that perspective. So this dissemination webinar is part of a broader array of actions and activities and initiatives related to local and urban governance over a period of time. There was a learning digest back in September. There was a talk series on finance. There was a utilization workshop that some folks in governance and we and others talked through kind of how to utilize this information. This dissemination webinar is kind of putting out that information to a broader group. But related to this idea of integration, one of the next steps for this work is really to put in action exactly what Spencer articulated. The fact that we need to be more clear about the messaging and the strategy behind, if you're going to be investing in cities and local governments, it's not just an investment in that lens. It really is an integrated approach so that you're addressing health outcomes, you're addressing education outcomes, you're addressing economic development outcomes through the service delivery, through the investment, through the capacity strengthening in those jurisdictions. And so moving forward, one of the next steps for us will be to build out that messaging and that strategy. And so yeah, thanks Maria for adding that learning digest from a couple weeks ago. So with that, we are now past time, and I know several people probably left for their next meeting, but I want to thank our contributors, Brendan, Spencer, Moira, and Kate. This has been a great conversation, and for those who are on and you have follow-up questions, reach out to me or to others, and then we'll also get the recording posted to for folks who haven't been able to be with us. So appreciate it, and everyone have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.